All right, welcome back. So today we are discussing a bit of a heavier topic, but quite important. Okay, we are talking about environmental defenders, activists, and the dangers they face, and how media often shapes the story, their safety, and their legitimacy. Right. So this is not an abstract topic. While we're having this conversation right now, people are being threatened, arrested, and killed for protecting land, water, forests, and communities. Okay. So in this lecture, you're going to learn, who these defenders are, what threats they face, and how media representation becomes a matter of life and death in some situations, right? So I'm hopeful that this lecture will make you a more critical consumer of news, and I hope a more thoughtful participant and ally in environmental conflicts. So here's what we're going to be getting into. So, first, I want you to understand what it means to be an environmental defender and recognize the diversity of environmental defense and environmental justice work beyond the stereotypical tree hugging activists. Okay. Second, I want to teach you how to analyze patterns of violence against defenders. We're going to look at some actual data and really understand how this is a very real and difficult challenge that needs to be addressed and needs more awareness. Third, we're going to talk about how to critically assess how media representation affects EJ activist safety and legitimacy in really concrete ways. Excuse me. And fourth, you're going to walk away with tools to evaluate, whose voices are getting amplified in this situation and whose voices, again, are silenced in the discussion. And I want you to apply these skills to some contemporary cases. So I'm going to talk about some examples, but I want you to think about this in terms of social safeguarding, FPIC, project development, right? There's real risk to advocating for environmental justice, for environmental rights across the globe. And a lot of you in your work, if you continue down this path, will encounter environmental conflicts in your careers, and you need to understand the stakes truly. So let's start with some definitions, as we often do. So the UN, the United Nations, defines environmental defenders as people who protect environmental and land rights, often putting themselves at considerable risk. But what does that actually look like on the ground, right? Environmental defense work includes indigenous communities protecting their ancestral homelands from extractive industries, from dispossession, from theft, anti-mining and anti-logging campaigns where local communities or activists are opposing projects that threaten their water, health, or livelihoods. Water rights advocacy in contexts of where dams, diversions, or pollutions might affect downstream communities and their livelihoods, their health, their way of life. Climate justice organizing that connects environmental damage to racial and economic inequality or advocates for decapitalist degrowth, and to making policy change towards climate justice. And also wildlife and forest conservation, right? Particularly community based conservation that conflicts with state or corporate interests. And community resistance, also very common to polluting industries, everything from coal plants to waste incinerators. So, something important to keep in mind is that many defenders do not use that term for themselves, right? They are farmers protecting their land. They are indigenous people exercising their sovereignty. They are mothers concerned about their children's health, right? These are everyday folks, your neighbors, you, right? The label environmental defender often gets applied by outside observers, NGOs, or media. So keep that in mind as we proceed. And I want to acknowledge that is, the term that I chose to use in this lecture. And I just want to, show that difference and dichotomy. So the scale of violence is quite shocking. It's staggering. So Global Witness conducted a study, research in 2023, investigative research, and they sought to track systematically the dangers that environmental defenders were facing. And so they showed that 196 environmental activists and defenders were killed in 2023 alone, right? So over 2,000 people have been killed in the past decade. Latin America is one of the most dangerous places for environmental activists. 85% of documented killings took place, as particularly in Colombia. The deadliest sectors are agricultural business or agribusiness, mining, and logging. So 1 in 10 victims were women. The women defenders often face gender-specific violence, including sexual assault. And indigenous peoples face disproportionate risk relative to their population. And these are documented cases with confirmed details. The actual numbers are almost certainly higher because many killings in remote areas go unreported or are deliberately misclassified by authorities as accidents, robberies, or personal disputes. So these numbers are shocking and they're probably a vast undercount. All right. So when a defender or an activist is killed in a remote area, maybe community has no media access. It never makes it into official statistics. There's no records. This can't be tracked. So why are defenders targeted, right? Why does this violence happen? Violence against environmental activists, it serves specific functions. It eliminates opposition to often profitable extractive projects. Someone opposing a mining concession who gets killed, well, they can't oppose it anymore. They can't organize people and they can't speak out. Violence creates fear to deter others, right? When one person is killed, 10 others may abandon this organizing work. They may not think it's worth it anymore. It might be too dangerous. Violence asserts territorial control. It sends a message about who has power in a particular space. Violence protects illegal resource extraction. Much of the violence is linked to illegal logging, wildlife trade, illegal mining, land theft. So this is illegal activity, right? Organized crime in some cases. People are trying to expose this, so they're targeted by the violent arm of these groups. And violence, again, of course, maintains existing power structures where elites are benefiting from environmental exploitation. So a key thing to remember is that this violence is often, it's rationalized from the perpetrator's perspective. I don't mean morally justified. I don't justify it at all, but it's strategically calculated in some situations, right? Defenders are threatening economic interests worth millions or even sometimes billions of dollars in profits. And from a purely instrumental standpoint, eliminating that threat makes economic sense to those profiting. Understanding this rationality helps us see that violence is not random or irrational in this situation. It's targeted and it's systematic, and it will continue unless something is done. So who is a defender? What does language mean, right? Well, it matters enormously here. Consider how the media labels people doing very similar actions, right? A defender implies legitimate protection of something valuable. Activist, which I've also used interchangeably here, as you've noticed, implies a political agenda and potential bias. Protester implies disruptive outsider, disrupting normal social order. What about criminal or terrorist, which we see used more and more every day? This implies an illegal threat that requires state response. How is this played out in American history in terms of the use of terrorist? It's the same action, it's different labels, and it results in profoundly different consequences. When media calls someone a defender, it's conferring legitimacy, right? But when media calls them a criminal, or you have officials calling them terrorists, it justifies state violence against them. It justifies violence against them. And these are not neutral descriptive choices, right? They are very strategic and political choices with real impacts on your perception, on the public perception, and defender safety, right? So pay attention to these labels when you consume news. They matter. They matter a great deal. And they are shaping the mindset, the agenda, the public discourse, perhaps more than you realize. So a case study that we can discuss that illustrates these dynamics is the case of Berta Cáceres in Honduras in 2016. Cáceres was a Lenca indigenous leader, and she was opposing the Agua Zarca Dam on the Gualcarque River. Okay, the dam threatened her indigenous territory and livelihoods. She received the Goldman Environmental Prize in 2015. This is the Nobel Prize for Environmentalism. It's often called that. A year later, about on March 2nd, 2016, she was assassinated in her home. International media coverage exploded after her death. I mean, this is one of the most visible examples. 8 people have been convicted in connection with her murder, but the intellectual authors, the people who ordered the killing, many argue they still remain in positions of power, the people who pulled the strings. And the question that I want you to consider, right, is why did international attention come too late for Cáceres, right? She had been receiving death threats for years. She had requested protection from authorities, but her case was ignored until she was dead. Okay, think about that. There's an incredible book that I used to make required reading for this course. Maybe I should do it again, but it's called Who Killed Berta Cáceres? Highly recommend you read it if you're interested in this topic. Really, really important book that I highly recommend to many of you. So you can compare this case to a case in Thailand, Chalathorn Srimuang. This is an ongoing situation, right? She defended community forests in Chayapum province from coal mining. She worked from 2016 to 2019, and she faced multiple criminal charges, including trespassing, defamation for her defense work, and she was imprisoned. Her legal battle lasted 7 years, and her charges were eventually dropped in 2023, despite this being a years-long persecution of her as an environmental defender. Have you ever heard her name? There was minimal international media coverage. A few specialized environmental outlets covered it, but her story was ignored. So why do some folks get global attention while others face similar or worse persecution and relative obscurity, right? Keep that in mind because we're going to return to it. A very visible case in the United States is the case of Standing Rock, the Standing Rock protests that took place from 2016 to 2017, right? This was indigenous-led opposition to the Dakota Access Pipeline, which threatened the water sources and crossed sacred sites of these indigenous tribes and communities, right? So water protectors, they opposed the pipeline construction. And the response to this was heavy police presence, arrests, use of water cannons and freezing temperatures. Many no DAPL protesters were injured, sent to the hospital. But it had massive social media presence. It was one of the biggest and maybe one of the earliest examples of social media being used so strongly in a protest effort. But the media framing shifted over time, if you're familiar with this, right? Early coverage called the participants protesters. Mid-campaign, when public perceptions were changing, some outlets adopted the term water protectors. And after the conflicts, some outlets reverted to calling them rioters and environmental terrorists. So, how did these competing narratives shape public understanding of what was happening and who was reasonable versus unreasonable, right? Public perception was completely polarized on this issue and still remains today. And a lot of the history, again, think back to historiography, has been rewritten around this issue, right? They lost, right? The pipeline was created. And, you know, how do these narratives shape over time and reshape over time, depending on who's telling the story, how media is engaged, right? I mean, this comes to the protection paradox, right? It's a very difficult paradox. Media visibility can both protect and endanger. Okay, so media can protect because it creates international accountability, right? If the world is watching, governments and corporations may face reputational costs for violence. Again, in today's reality, we see this power diminishing more and more. Media can mobilize support networks, right? People can send money, legal support, political pressure can be applied. Again, this is still very powerful and should not be discounted. It's incredibly powerful still, even though we see the accountability mechanisms slowly eroding over time, right? This is tough to talk about and the things we face today, but media can document human rights violations, right? It can create evidence for future accountability, and it's incredibly important that we document and we keep a record of this for history, right? And we have to try our best to hold people accountable, right? And it can pressure governments and corporations to change their behavior, but again, we see this leveraging power um, becoming less and less, I mean, almost in real time right now. So we have to think about this, right? We have to critically examine this, think about our strategies and our tactics. Think about how we're doing media, think about how we're supporting those folks who are engaging in environmental justice. But again, we see more and more that media endangers, right? It makes uh, defenders easier to locate for those who want to harm them. It provides information to adversaries about their strategies and networks. It can increase the perceived threat that they pose to powerful interests, paradoxically making violence more likely. And it exposes their community members who may have not chosen to engage in this or to be publicly visible. Have to think about that, right? Defenders, they navigate this paradox constantly, right? So is visibility safer than obscurity? There's no universal answer to that, right? It depends on context, on who has power locally, and what kind of media attention you can or are getting. Okay, and again, you know, you're familiar with this, but there's different types of media coverage, right? They operate differently, though, right? International news media, this tends to be more episodic coverage focused on dramatic events, a killing, a major protest, a high-profile arrest. It's international, right? There's a lot of things to cover, right? It often arrives after violence occurs rather than preventing it, right? International media tends to center on dramatic individual stories. Berta Cáceres is a good example. But this approach may miss the structural conditions that are producing violence in the first place, right? Local media is often, providing the ongoing coverage, but it has limited reach. This is changing a little bit as we evolve in the media landscape. But a local newspaper in a rural region might follow a land conflict for years, but the international actors never see it, right? Local media may face pressure from local power holders in many contexts. Local journalists covering environmental conflicts face the same threats as defenders. But local media is sometimes the only source of documentation when international media isn't interested. And local media is under threat across the globe, being defunded, being targeted for violence. I mean, a stark example of this is local media in Mexico covering the drug war. Um, you know, Something to think about. Very serious. Social media, as we're all familiar, provides that rapid information sharing. Someone tweets about it, a TikTok is posted about it. Defenders can control their own narrative on social media rather than relying on journalists to frame their stories. But now we see more social media control and filters being placed. But again, real-time documentation means violence can be recorded and shared immediately, which is very important for evidence keeping. But again, it creates surveillance risks, and authorities can track and control the narrative. And doxing is more and more common, where people's information is shared, so they can become easily targeted at home. Their family members can become targeted. And again, misinformation is rampant across social media, as you're aware. Alternative media is important, has always been important, and is, again, deeply under threat. Outlets specifically focused on environmental justice, indigenous media platforms, community radio like PBS and NPR, which have been defunded, but they're already under resourced, and are having their resources taken from them at rapid rates. So whose stories get told? Let's examine that, right? Because it's not random. English-speaking defenders get more international attention than those speaking other languages. Urban conflicts get covered more than rural. A mining conflict near a major city is going to get more coverage than one in a remote rainforest in many cases. Photogenic protests, as wild as that sounds, they get covered more than slow violence. Think about big flashy rallies with signs and inflatables. Think about violence, which gets picked up more, which is more palatable for the general public, right? A dramatic confrontation with police is often more newsworthy than decades of gradual poisoning from industrial pollution, right? Like, were you familiar with the story of Cancer Alley before we talked about it in this course? I hope you were, but were you? I mean, Flint, Michigan was a big story, but, did it make it to your news cycle? Are you familiar with it? Individual heroes often get centered over collective movements, especially charismatic, attractive, well spoken individual heroes. Can be good or bad. Again, media loves a charismatic leader, but will often ignore the community organizers on the ground that's making the movement possible. And of course, the global north receives a disproportionate amount of coverage. Just full stop. Environmental conflicts in Europe or North America, they get more attention than those in the global south by and by. And that is where most defenders are being killed. So you have uneven protection, uneven accountability, and some folks have the world watching while others face violence in the dark, right? We can make a difference for this. Another, issue is the framing. Framing is really powerful, right? So imagine the same situation framed three different ways, right? One framing says illegal protesters block economic development project. What does that evoke for you, right? This frames the activists or the protesters or the defenders, all different terms, as breaking laws and preventing legitimate economic activity, which for many folks has become more important than many things, where we value profits, products over people, sometimes property over people. Framing two, indigenous community defends ancestral territory. This is framing the people involved as protecting something that they legitimately possess. Here's another framing. Environmental activists clash with police. This frames both sides as equally involved in conflict, same event, different problem definitions, right? Different assignment of heroes and villains, different implied solutions. In framing one, the solution is law enforcement, pretty clear. Framing two, the solution is let's respect indigenous rights. In framing three, the solution is conflict resolution. Maybe. Whether you read environmental news makes a difference, right? And it makes a difference on how you're going to identify the frame. So ask yourself what problem definition is being naturalized is obvious. And are you just accepting the framing that you're being told or fed in your news feed, on your TV, on your computer, right? Think about this. It matters. Criminalization is also really big, right? Governments and corporations are increasingly using legal systems to suppress environmental defense and environmental justice work. There are many strategic lawsuits against public participation. These are called SLAPP suits. They will file expensive defamation lawsuits against offenders who speak publicly. This is very common. And even if the defender wins, the legal costs will often bankrupt them. So it's often not worth the fight. It's a great way to silence and suppress very easily through the legal system. Terrorism charges can get applied to protest actions. Scary. We see it more and more. In multiple countries, pipeline protesters can face terrorism charges, end up in jail. There is cases of environmental sabotage. We can't deny that, right? But these laws can then criminalize even small scale. They can become too far reaching. They can start to silence free speech and our right to organize and nonviolent protest. Trespass charges can get applied to indigenous land when they don't have the formal land title. So it is their indigenous homeland. The land belongs to them. They've lived on it for centuries, but no legal land title. So now you're trespassers. Happens many times when protected areas are established. There can also be tax investigations of NGOs that can shut down the funding streams if they're funded through a federal or local government. Those funding mechanisms can be frozen. It's happening right now. And, It's tough. It's happening right now, all the time. The real question, right, is does coverage legitimize or challenge this criminalization, right? Are we falling more and more into this language of legalese, this policing language, this military language, right? Against people who are advocating for the health of their children and communities, advocating for equal treatment, access, voice in the decisions around capital and how factories and waste sites and protected areas and laws are created, right? Fundamental human rights. When media uncritically repeats government framing and talking points that defenders are criminals, protesters are criminals, well, it's just building criminalization, a narrative, a culture of criminalization. When media interrogates these charges and explores their political motivations, does investigative journalism, calls into critical question the dominant narrative, well, then we're challenging this criminalization culture. Okay? A very powerful case study is Amazon defenders, and there's many of them, right? But this case in Brazil is a pretty stark example, right? So in Brazil, at least 20 documented killings in the Amazon region were reported in 2023. Okay, in June 2022, British journalist Dom Phillips and Brazilian indigenous and activist Bruno Pereira were murdered in the Amazon. You probably didn't hear about this, right? And this generated massive global media attention because Phillips was a foreign journalist working for The Guardian. But the local defenders had been killed before with minimal coverage and have been killed since with minimal coverage. Indigenous land monitors in this region face systemic targeting because they are documenting illegal logging and mining. So why does a journalist's death attract exponentially more coverage than defender deaths? You know, Philip's death was a tragedy, absolutely, no doubt about it. You know, but so were the deaths of many peoples whose names you will never hear, whose names I don't have, I can't find, right? What does that disparity tell us about whose lives media treats as valuable, as newsworthy? So digital security is now central to what we do to defender safety, to environmental justice work, right? Smartphones and social media generate location data that can help track this work. We have to be careful. Communications are being surveilled more and more. Facial recognition can identify your participants for targeting. Hacked databases can expose networks and strategies. There's targeted online harassment campaigns against, you know, we've seen this against women, and these are systematic and severe. We have doxing and swatting going on to folks where they're being put in real harm of state-sanctioned violence, right? Media has a responsibility. We need to protect sources by not including identifying details unnecessarily, right? And this also matters for research. We need to verify information before publishing. Misinformation can get people killed. We need to avoid exposing people by thinking about how we're using photos about their faces or the locations without consent. Again, we're not seeking to censor, but we have to have safety protocols in what we do and the work that we're doing. So again, this is bleak, right? This is tough. This is a tough lecture for me to get through because of the environment, the ecosystem, the vibes we're currently living through, right? So what works? What can you do? Well, digital security training is very important. Very, very important to learn how to protect communications, location data. You know, if you're working with communities who are going to engage in advocacy or activism, it might be worth thinking about how you can support this through grant funding. Support this through training if you have training in this, right? Bringing in networks to help build capacity. Rapid response networks, where you can have, protocols set up to alert international partners, to alert the media, to, set up safety protocols, documentation protocols to record threats, to create accountability mechanisms and accountability chains. Thinking about strategic media engagement, right? Choosing when visibility helps and when it endangers. We need more of these strategic media and communication experts supporting these causes. We need more international solidarity networks that can create protection. We also need mutual aid networks and communities who can support with resources, can support with bail funds and food funds and all kinds of different things to help support causes when they're targeted. And we need to hold media more accountable. Just full stop. We need to support more responsible reporting practices that prioritize safety, that prioritize multiple perspectives of narratives, that prioritize critical examination and transparent fact checking, that isn't afraid of harm, that pushes back on targeting. And we need to center affected communities rather than these outside experts telling stories, these journalists, these researchers, right? These documentary hosts. Tell the stories of the people in the communities. Let them speak for themselves safely, right? We need to follow rather than lead with coverage, meaning respect communities' decisions about when and how their stories get told as well, right? That's important as well. And we need to have more long-term coverage rather than this just sort of episodic, flashy, flash in the pan sort of stuff that shows the dramatic moments and then disappears, right? I don't know how we overcome this with our short attention span and our media news cycle. It's just like drinking from a fire hose, but it's important. So what can you actually do? I can give you some practical actions. We can talk more about in office hours if you want some more things, but follow these folks on social media. Help amplify their voices directly rather than these intermediary accounts, right? Support organizations like Global Witness, Frontline Defenders, Global Green Grants Fund, regional environmental justice networks financially if you can. Donate money, right? To Manga Bay. Be a reader of Manga Bay. Commons Grounds, right? Intersectional environmentalism. These are all accounts and groups that you should be supporting. Volunteer if you can. NARF is located in Boulder, Native American Rights Fund. They often have volunteer opportunities. Critically analyze, media framing in your own consumption. This is so key. When you read news, ask whose perspective is centered, whose is marginalized, right? Where's this news coming from? Who funds this news? Is there a political agenda here? Are they operating out of fear? We can't accept things at face value. Now more than ever. As AI just floods so much of what we do as well with fake images, video, stories. We have to push back on this, right? Amplify defender voices when they choose to speak publicly, but be careful, right? Be sure that you're doing that with their consent, within their plans. Ask them, how can I support, right? How can I share this? How would you like this message to be shared? How do you feel comfortable? Let's work together on a campaign, right? And learn from environmental justice scholarship, right? Many people laid the groundwork through the civil rights movement, through the early environmental justice movement, and have and continue to do this work today, right? Read. Recognize your own positionality in these conflicts, your own power. What can you do? Where do you sit in hierarchies of power and privilege, right? How does that shape what you can and should do? Are you going to be a bystander? Are you going to be an ally? Are you going to be an accomplice? How does that change, right? Small actions matter. Collective action matters, especially when it's multiplied across many people. Together, we can make a difference, okay? So again, environmental defenders face systematic violence globally that needs to be addressed. We need systemic and structural change. That's a common theme in this course, right? Media representation can be both good and bad and affect safety and legitimacy in measurable ways, right? Coverage will often reflect and reinforce power inequalities. Who's getting the coverage is not random, right? It's who media values and treats as important. Framing determines whose appears reasonable and who appears threatening in environmental conflicts. I mean, think about environmental conflicts of recent. Talk to your friends, your family. Maybe not around dinner time or the holidays. It might not go well, but ask them what their perspectives were. Where did they hear that information, right? I mean, the media is shaping our narratives every day, right? And engage critically and supportively when you can, but don't romanticize or appropriate their struggles. You don't need to be the savior. There are many folks on the ground who can lead, who can speak, right? How can you use your power and positionality, your privilege to amplify, to empower, to bridge, to build capacity? But do you really need to take the credit for it? Do you really need to be visible? Do you need to be the face of that? Do you need to get the pat on the back, right? The critical question I want to leave you with is, whose interest does current media coverage operate for? When environmental conflicts get covered, who benefits from how they're framed? When conflicts don't get covered at all, who benefits from that silence? These aren't rhetorical questions, right? They have answers. I want you to figure out what those answers are. Pay attention to whose voices you're hearing and whose you're not.